So before we get into the details of some best practices, these are the overall steps of survey planning. You start off with what questions you have to evaluate, that you think about the sources of information. Then comes how you select your sample. Then the methods, data collection that we talked about in the last week's training. Then about the survey questions, which are different from evaluation questions. Evaluation questions are the big picture ones that will drive your survey questions. Then pre-testing and the data quality and presentation. So we'll be talking some of the aspects of sampling and survey questions today. So coming to the best practices for designing surveys. So we'll first see some best practices for online surveys. One of the best practices is to decide well in advance how the survey will be programmed and hosted. So by this, what I mean is like think about the software you'll use to design the survey. We all have free access to Qualtrics through ANR. I'll share in the resources Qualtrics 101 video and a PowerPoint that was developed by University of Wisconsin Extension, where it talks about the different types of questions that can be used in Qualtrics. The next point to consider is to evaluate the technological capabilities and preferences of the sample that you'll be surveying, like whether or not the people will be competent enough to take an online survey or like an offline survey, and also the preferences of the sample. A research conducted on an evaluation of a Manure Expo in 2016 indicates some preferences. They identify that people like working for agencies or extension or scientists or people housed in universities, they prefer an online survey to a paper survey. Whereas in that study, respondents like manure haulers, livestock farmers, and they identify the other categories as blue collar workers. They preferred a paper survey. They asked for people's preferences who attended that Manure Expo. Then the next point to consider is to see that questions are displayed similarly across different devices and browsers. So we need to check if the survey is accessible on different internet browsers, web browsers, and also across all the different devices that people may use to take the survey. For example, we can check in Qualtrics, we can check how the survey will be displayed in mobile phones, for example. So we have to do that. That's really important. And then have interesting and informative welcome and closing screens. What I usually do with a welcome screen, like the first page of the survey, is to very clearly state the purpose of the study and how the results will be used is very important to indicate right up front. And also don't forget to give your contact information for people to reach out for anything. And that is very important. And coming to the closing screen, we need to always thank the people for taking the survey. And in Qualtrics, especially, we can indicate something like, please hit the next arrow one last time so that your recorded, like responses will be recorded. And the other points to consider is we have to decide in advance how many questions you want to have per page. Always use the page break because that has been found to make it very easy for people to take the surveys and also to increase the respondent rate. And also have some logic to pairing up similar questions in one page. Maybe the questions related to a particular concept within your evaluation study or like a particular outcome. And then it's always very important to allow respondents to back up in a survey. I see sometimes that there is no arrow to go back. So that is always important to give a chance to go back to the previous screens. Then double check, please don't forget to double check the multiple answer choice questions, because my experience has been that when there is like check all that apply type of a question, but the answer choices, maybe we'll forget to include, like select the one that allows the people to make multiple choices. But we end up sometimes doing like giving only one single choice option. And then it's also important to keep the flow of low to high or negative to positive scales consistent throughout the questionnaire. By this, what I mean is if you have like a disagree to agree or agree to disagree or low to high or high to low, please keep that consistent throughout the survey for all the questions, because people may get into like a set frame while answering the questions and may assume that all the questions will have responses that flow from one way to other. Then the other thing on which there is no common agreement is to consider whether or not to use a progress indicator. I think it is good to use a progress indicator, but I've been asked on some projects by my colleagues not to use a progress indicator. I believe that might be the case when the survey is very long and they don't want the people to see how much the survey has been completed. But one of the other good practices is always to mention how much time it will take in the introduction part for the survey to get completed. And then the next point to consider is allow the respondents to save and finish the survey later. We can do that in Qualtrics, and that is definitely very helpful for people. If they start the survey and if they want to save it for some reason and come back later, that's really good. And always consider using multiple contacts and vary the message which each contact, the subject line has to be different, like requesting them the participation. And have at least 4 contacts unless your study has a unique situation where you may not want to follow up with the non-respondents. It's always good to use multiple contacts, minimum 4. But for online surveys, the literature says that you can go more than 4 follow-ups. But it is good not to kind of have too many follow-ups and kind of fill the people's inboxes with our survey emails. And then take steps to ensure that emails are not flagged as spam. So some of the tips we can use is to avoid using words like survey or hyphenated kind of things in the subject line, which have been found to be identified by spam filters, and then they may get filtered as spam. So these are a few other points that can improve the response rate when you are using Qualtrics. As we discussed, like have page breaks, add progress bar based on your situation, consistency in answer categories, and then consider using skip patterns and display logic where you can save a lot of space for questions when you are doing online. And then all this is covered in the video I'll share in the resources with like from the Qualtrics 101 training. And then consider using special features, like there are different types of questions that you can use, like heat maps and all those kind of questions, which you can access through that video. And then to the extent possible, have a minimum number of open-ended questions. But if you need to have open-ended question, research shows that having an importance prompt and a bigger text box has been found to improve the response. By importance prompt, what I mean is that tell very briefly, like this question is very important for us to know for whatever reason, and then ask the question. And then always allow the respondents to report problems and ask questions. Maybe that can be served by giving your contact information, the mode of communication that you prefer, a phone or an email, that you are more likely to respond within a reasonable amount of time from the time you receive that email. And always have a professional look to the survey. So you can use UCNR logos that are available in our website. This makes the survey look more professional and also adds the trust factor that it is coming from a good source. And also, as we discussed last week, pilot testing is really important before you send out the main survey. Have a pilot test done, and assure confidentiality or privacy in the introduction welcome screen. And also briefly tell how the community may benefit if they take the survey and participate in this, because the psychology literature states that like if people see a value in what they're contributing to the lives of other people, they are more likely to participate, and also have some kind of incentives. We'll cover a little bit about incentives in the next few slides. And for mail surveys, if you have to keep, if you can't restrict your survey to one page, which is a recommended practice, keep the survey as short as possible. Consider having it in a booklet form so that it appears less busy and have more white space. Decide on the question layout and order. As we discussed in online surveys, the layout and order are really important. For example, if demographics are not the most essential part for your survey, then you can have them toward the end of the survey. Again, like we have to include only those questions that are really needed for this survey. But if you need to ask like more questions, then decide about where you want to ask them. And to the extent possible, personalize all contacts, the welcome letter, the invitation letter. If the sample is small enough, you can sign each of those letters personally. But if it's a very big sample, then you may not be able to do that. And again, as with the online surveys, have interesting and informative front and back cover pages. And this is really important for mail surveys. Take steps to ensure that mailings will not be mistaken for junk mail or marketing materials. And one of the ways you can do that is not to have very flashy kind of paper or a flashy kind of screen like information. And then strategically time all the contacts, like kind of avoiding any important holiday time or like downtime, that kind of a thing for follow-ups. And then if you want to follow up with the non-respondents, which is a recommended practice, you may need to assign an individual ID number so that we know who responded and who hasn't. But then I have experienced that some people strike off the ID number thinking that we are trying to track them. But those kind of situations can be maybe avoided if we indicate why we are using that ID number. And also send a token of appreciation with the survey request. Just tell them that you appreciate their time. And if the incentives are possible, then we can give some kind of incentives. And a few other survey best practices applicable for both online and mail surveys. As we discussed, keep the email letter short and to the point, the opening letter, opening screen, and also the email that goes out. Have like use smaller paragraphs and sentences. And if you're using paper surveys, have more white space, so it makes it appear less busy. And also look up for design and visualization principles. If there are any design or visualization principles that can be applicable to your participants. For example, if you're doing something with a population that's more into video games or tech-friendly kind of, there is this theory called as gamification theory, which states that you can design the survey so that it appears or looks like a video game. So those kind of things, look up any design or visualization principles or theories. Now we'll see a little bit about survey incentives before Roshan takes this on and talks about it. So incentives have been found to increase the response rate. So the research shows that a pre-token kind of an incentive is results in a better response rate compared to like a random lottery or something that will be drawn later. And for in our colleagues, in our example, the IPM team, I think, has used gas cards, and I think they have found some good response rate. And our dairy advisors have used Starbucks gift cards, and they say that they got good response rate. And I think Kit, who is presenting on this, has used some Target gift cards or something like that. And some points to remember is that there is a limit to you purchase these kind of incentives using our business cards. And I think you have to keep it below 500, like $499 or something per purchase. And also there is a policy around how we cannot use state funds. So maybe you can use your grant money from other sources for buying these incentives. But these are all the factors that we have to remember. And also some studies have shown that monetary incentives may not work the way we want or we anticipate. For example, in a big study that we did, which the survey went out to thousands of people on climate, the use information, the climate tools. We found that there was no statistically significant difference between the control group which didn't receive any incentive with the groups that received incentives. The response rate for the groups that received the incentive was more, but it was not significantly more. So if you want to go for incentives, if we do not have money, then there are other ways of sending appreciation, like thanking them for taking the survey afterwards and indicating how what value they contribute to the study. These are all like really important factors that we need to consider. Now Roshan will take it on from here.
Vikram, could you answer one question in the chat from Cindy? Is that below $500 per purchase per day?
I am not very sure if it's per day, but I'm sure it is per purchase. If I remember right, Betsy Corley was the person who shared this example with me. So I can check and get back to Cindy on that. Any other questions? I'm not able to see the chat, so.
I don't see any other questions in the chat. Thanks.
Okay. Roshan, you want to take it over from here?
Thanks, Vikram, for the presentation on conducting the best practices on conducting surveys. So once the survey is ready in the next process, the question comes to my mind, what would be the right sample and who will be reaching out to get estimates for your survey variables? That's the question that comes next. And to help with that, so I'm just very basically I will just cover the basic sampling designs and the practices that can be adopted to collect the data from the sample. So the question arises next, like how to conduct the samples, like who to include in the sample and what's the best way to collect the data from that sample. So basically the population in a study is basically the individuals, or in this case the individuals or the units that are they qualify to be part of your study. So, and one of the purpose of doing sampling is to reduce the expense and also the logistic requirement to collect the data that best represent your population's estimates. And the questions arises whether you want to do a random sampling or it will be a purpose sampling. So the purpose sampling it's more convenient to do, but the random sampling, if you consider to do, it reduces the sample errors, all the errors associated with when you do the analysis to find the estimate for the population. So, and also study shows that the data quality when we do the census study is almost equivalent to the sample estimates if we adopt the best sampling design appropriate for your study. So in the next slide, I'm going to show you in a pictorial overview of the target population and the sample. And so Vikram, next slide, please. Yeah, thank you. So while doing the sampling, the things that come to mind is a sample frame and your target population. The target population, as I mentioned before, is the population that meets the criteria of your study. The characteristics matches the individual character matches the population. So this is the target population has so many individuals or elements or units is collectively. So then we use a sampling frame that lists all those units, the population unit to be included in the study potentially. But there are some issues again associated with the sampling frame when we consider. So you can see that there in the sample frame that potentially should be included all this target population list, but sometimes some of the elements in the sampling frame are not eligible based on the criteria you set for your study. And then there are some of the things that again you can see that some part of your sample frame is not reachable, or there are some individuals or in your sample frame is not, they refuse to respond to the surveys, or they are not in a situation or in a position that they can respond to the study. So this is a pictorial overview of the target population, which is a then we draw the sample out of the target population using a sample frame. So in the next slide, I will be discussing about the characteristics of a sample frame that we should consider, and against the deficiency that arises usually when we use sampling frame to select the sample for our surveys. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned before, sampling frame is basically a list of units or the individuals. In our case, if we're doing surveys with the participants of a program, and this is the list, and the sample frame lists some of their contact information or address information on how to the ways to access easily to the sampling unit. So, and then the things to be considered here is considering the best sample frame is to what extent it cover the target population, whether the coverage is complete or incomplete, and to what extent this covers the target population. Again, also you have to look for in your sample frame whether the listings are the individual listing or is a cluster listing. If your target elements is the individuals, but you have the house address, for example, like the house address, then probably it is a kind of a group. So the groups are available, and you don't know who is responding to your mail survey. And also another things to consider while selecting the best sampling frame is whether it has unwanted listing or not. So are they meeting your study criteria or not? Again, the issue arises against the duplications. If the listing appears multiple times, the possibility of you collecting data multiple times is also there is a chance. For example, if you have for one individual you have like 2 or 3 email addresses, and that means you're collecting duplicate data. Another things to be considered is accessibility of the sample elements, what's the best way to reach out to your sample unit is, whether to use the email address or you want to use the house address. So which is more convenient. And some of the things to consider is if one sample frame is not complete in your view, maybe there is a possibility, or if you would like to, you can use multiple sample frame the way it is appropriate for your study. Yeah, next slide, please. So again, as I mentioned in the previous slide, there is the characteristics of a good sampling frame. Again, this is some of the deficiency that arise in many sample frames is the missing element. When it is basically the coverage issues where the sample frame is not complete. So in this situation, the best way is to look for another sample frame that can be used as a supplement to your current sample frame. Again, as I mentioned before, whether this, for example, in the case of houses versus individuals, so the clusters can be problematic, for example, or maybe one house or it's a dwelling. So based on that, the cluster can be problematic to reach out to your target participants or audience. So in this case, the best way it'd be to include all clusters from the sampling frame in your study. And also when there are blanks information are available, when the information is not complete, the best practices would be to delete them. And if in the case of duplicate listing, the one approach is to either not include all those duplicates, or maybe include the first choice appears in the sampling frame, and then remove the remaining duplicate listings. Next slide, please. Yeah, after that, so now in the next few slides, I would like to discuss about the sampling designs, the basic sampling designs. And one of those design is a very common one, is the simple random sampling. Simple random sampling is where so that every individual in the population has the equal chance, or would say probability, being selected for the study. And this also reduces the sample errors for when you are doing the analysis to come up with the best estimate for the variables you're looking for your study. And one of the method for doing that is a lottery method, where you just haphazardly pick the identification numbers of individuals. And the other method could be use a random number table. So there are so many ways to use the random number table, which is a little bit, which is beyond the scope of this webinar. So there are some of the research papers, they have come up with these random tables that it can be accessed and used to identify the sample, sample elements for your study. But this could be a tedious task based on how you are going to use these tables based on your identification number of your participants or sample or the population identification numbers. So, but the best way is to use the computer programs to generate random numbers. So in this way, the potential participants have a unique identification number, and you generate random numbers, and then you match those identification numbers with these randomly generated numbers, and then that way you can select those individuals for your study. And the next slide, and the next one is it's another simple way of doing the sample, selecting a sample for your study. It is called a systematic sample. Basically, the things you need to have is an estimate of the total population size. For example, if your population is 1,000 and you need 100, for example, 100 like a sample, then you can just divide the total number of individuals or individuals in the population, for example, 1,000, and then the sample size could be is 100, so it would be, the K would be the 10th. So every 10th individual will be a part of your study. So and then again, you can, for the starting point of the systematic sample, you can choose from any number between 1 to 10 and then move forward. But there is, again, things to be considered. The challenges and the issues again here is sometimes what happens in a sample frame, there could be this listing could be in a cyclical arrangement. For example, every 10th individuals, or every last 5 individuals in a list of 10 individuals, they are repeatedly getting a C grades, or their grade is they're getting a D grade. So that means all individuals you select, they have a very common characteristics of getting a D. So that means there is less variation in your sample. And then sometimes what happens is the numbers is not equally divisible. For example, it could be you have if your total population is 1,000 and the number is maybe some odd number, for example, you decided to select 138 or something, and then you'll get a fraction. In that situation, either you choose to rounding up or rounding down. So the number of elements or the individuals you would like to select for your study could be either less or it will be more. So in that situation, there are some ways to get the exact number of individuals for your study. So there are some ways. For example, is rounding off for alternate. For example, if it's less than 0.2 0.5, then you can round it up to the previous digit. If it's more than 0.5, then you can round it to the next digit. But again, you have to keep adding. So this things gets a little bit complicated here. So I would not like to take more time on this issue, but this is one issue you should consider, rounding up and rounding down issues while considering the systematic sample designs for your study. And the next one is the stratification. Stratification is, again, when you have decided to add some strata. Strata is subpopulation. So if you like to have representation of all subpopulations in your sample, and this is one of the best method to approach, I would say. For example, if you would like to have equal proportion of boys and girls, for example, in your study, and you have an estimate of how many the proportion of boys and girls in a population, maybe you can use the same sample proportion population's proportion to your sample. So if you are using the same proportion, then it would be a proportionate stratifications we call. Or if you're not following exactly the same proportion rule, then it would be a disproportionate stratification. So, but the things to be considered here is for a proportional sampling, that the sample size should be a proportional to the stratum population proportion. So again, so whenever you consider grouping grouping the population, you have to understand, you have to consider whether doing grouping or dividing the population in a stratum is convenient, or after doing that, whether it is accessible to collect data from that particular subsample. For example, if you are dividing a population based on the race, and then you decided collecting data from a particular race is not convenient, then doing a proportional sampling or proportional stratification is not justifiable in this situation. Next slide, please. So another thing is a very common, again, in the cluster sampling, and cluster and the stratification is the basic ways of grouping the population. And then there is a multi-stage sampling. So in the cluster in the stratification sampling, we followed the rule of the proportions for population proportions. And the cluster sampling is the population is divided into various clusters or groups, and then we sample those clusters. So that means thinking this way is that we are grouping those population in clusters, and now we are selecting a few clusters to be included in your study. And then all individuals or all elements in a particular cluster is a part of the study. And then if we decided to, again, implement some sampling methods within the cluster, then it will be a two-stage sampling again. Again, one of the other things is, for a convenience purpose, is the multi-stage sampling, where, for example, if you want to a survey with all the students in the United States, then a first step would be you have a sample of schools, then you choose schools that has homeroom classes. From the homeroom classes, then you sample the students. So there is a multi-level include here. So this is the data, the sampling has been done at a multiple stages. So this is again a multi-stage sampling. So based on your study size and the convenient, whether it is convenient or not, you can decide it which one is appropriate for a study. And cluster design has been used in many studies where it is easier to access the schools to collect the data. For example, in this situation, the school is an example, but it's based on accessibility to the site and the clusters. But again, you have to consider a lot of characteristics that defines a cluster. Another ways is getting popular is, next slide please, is the two-phase sampling. For big studies, you first do a sampling, you collect your first stage of data. For the second stage of data, you can just select a proportion of the previous sample. For example, if you're doing a study to answer some of your research questions, then you decide that you need more information to support some of the findings from your the first surveys, for example, and then maybe you don't have to collect the data from entire sample, but instead of that, you can select a small proportion of the sample and then collect the data. But again, the challenge would be, because this is a multi-phase sampling, so you have to there is some other factors, like for example time and loss of information could be a challenge part here if you're planning to do a two-phase sampling. Again, another one is the dual frame sampling. This is something when there are issues with coverage issues with one sample frame. In this situation, what we do is we use multiple frames so that we can reach out to all the sampling. We can include all the population, and make sure both the sample frame cover the maximum extent to the population, and then we do this implement the sampling designs in both the frames to collect the sample, and then it makes it easier for us to reach out to the sample elements or individuals or unit. So this is again, this is going back to the topic of sampling frame, where one sampling frame is not adequate, and basically the idea is that. So while covering those basics of the sampling design, this questions comes to our mind is, what would be the appropriate sample size for our study? So this depends on several factors. There is a concept that the larger the population is, the smaller the sample size would be. So this is true, depends on to what extent you want to keep the probability level and maintain the margin of errors, and again the population percentage. So I have listed here the three factors mainly to calculate a sample size for your study. The probability, the percentage of probability is is usually we keep it either 95% or 99% or 99.9%, depending on the percentage of depending on the confidence interval we choose for our survey, the estimates and the sample estimates. Again, then we have to come up with a margin of error that is allowable for our study. So the margin of error is, again, basically usually we keep it at 3% or 5%. So this is the link. It will take you to a website where you can enter the data. You can put a number for your, an estimate number of your population, and then the confidence interval you want, and the margin of error, and the population percentage. Population percentage is basically 50%. We keep it at 50%. That gives the maximum the variability in the data. So you can see that the more you increase the population size, the sample size will decrease. With that, I would like to see if anybody has any questions.
Roshan, I just have a view. Hello, are you able to hear me?
Yeah, sure.
So I think you covered it, but we usually use 95% confidence level, right? That's I think you can make it as a recommendation, right? For social science, it can be 5% margin of error is acceptable.
Yeah, 5% of margin of error. Then if you wanted to increase the strength of the statistics, then we can move to 99%. But 95% is widely used.
Yeah, so 99% is mostly used in the research that where the variables can be more controlled, right? Like field trials and those kind of things.
The clinical trials.
Yeah, okay. Okay, so if there are no other questions, we can move on to the next section, right? Kit, we don't have any other questions, right, in chat?
Correct, no other questions.
Okay, thank you, Roshan.
Thank you.
So before we break in 10 minutes, we'll see some of the guidelines for writing good survey questions. So these are the current best practices that I have gleaned from literature and also from my own experiences. So when we present this and discuss this, please share if you think there are some points that are missing and I can add to the list in the future trainings. So this is from a standard textbook in education and extension education guidelines. As I said, I have added quite a few from my own experience. We'll see the guidelines now, and then the activity that follows this, we'll use these guidelines to improve the questions. I think those questions in the activity part can be improved. So the first guideline is to make the survey question very simple as you can state it, short and direct. Be very specific. If you ask like about a particular practice or a particular outcome, be very specific what aspect within that outcome you are asking. We'll see the examples when we do the activity. So these are the guidelines for writing survey questions, but this kind of thinking, I believe, can inform any type of questions that we can ask, like even if you use other data collection methods like interviews or anything like observation. So the second guideline is phrase the questions in a way that they can be understood by every respondent in your sample. So one of the tips that you can use is one of the criteria is like whoever may be the person who may be the least literate in taking the survey, will that person, she or he, they understand it? And the next guideline is to do not use abbreviations, slang, or acronyms. Sometimes some of the words like IPM or the words like that may appear very common sense to us, like USDA or those kind of words, but it is better to avoid any kind of abbreviations. And if you have to use it multiple times in the survey, at least the very first time where you mention it, give the full form and then in parentheses abbreviate it so that people know what it means, any of the people that may not know. Then the next guideline is to phrase the questions, write them in a way so that they we can get unambiguous answers. So we'll see an example for this, like, so quantify responses wherever possible so that everyone taking the survey may have a common same type of understanding. Like, for example, if you say regularly, frequently, those kind of things may mean different things to different people. So if possible, quantify those kind of responses. Operationally define what regularly means for this particular question. Then the next guideline is to avoid any bias that may predetermine a respondent's answer. So don't add any value statements or adjectives to the question that may make people to respond in a particular way. And also avoid questions that might lead to unstated assumptions. So don't assume a particular type of a background for a person unless you know it well in advance. Okay, these are all like high school graduates, or these are all married people, or anything like that. If you want to ask any questions about that, if you don't have that information, then don't make any assumptions. And then at any cost, we need to avoid leading questions which imply a desired response. We'll see an example of this in the activity. And also, we have to be culturally responsive and avoid questions that may elicit embarrassment, suspicion, or hostility in respondents. And this question, like, we need to consider when we deal with different types of clientele base. Like, for example, in for some people, asking them about their income level or those kind of things may be not very easy for them to give the answer for that. And the next one, like avoiding double-barreled questions. This is the most commonly, this is the most common guideline that is violated in many of the surveys that I have seen. So by double-barreled questions, I mean a question that has two different things. And if people have different responses for those different things that you're asking, the usefulness of the data will be at question. And then the next guideline is to avoid random questions. So by random questions, what I mean are the questions that are not directly related to your evaluation outcomes or research questions. Sometimes there is a temptation to ask or include questions that are important for us to know for some other purposes in our work. So it's better to avoid those kind of questions, even if it's one or two questions. But if you really want information for some other purposes also, and you don't want to send out multiple surveys because survey fatigue is a reality, restrict those types of questions to the extent possible. And avoid double negatives in a question. We'll see an example in our activity. So this can confuse people. If not the meaning of the question, this can confuse some kind of people. And then it's always important to remember that we have to make sure all the alternatives we give for a question, the answer options, are exhaustive. And if we are not sure that they are exhaustive, it's always a good practice to give another option and give a text box where they can type in that whatever they feel is the other option. And when you have answer choices, they have to be mutually exclusive. If you have two choices that are overlapping, then the usefulness, the validity of the data gathered from such questions is not good. And then the next guideline is ensure that the respondents have the information necessary to answer the question. Again, here, like don't assume that people may be knowing about the topic that you ask unless you are very sure that your clientele will all will have the necessary information to answer the question. It is better to give a brief statement or two about what you are asking. Like for example, if you are asking about a new policy or something, just give in one or two lines what that policy, the salient feature of that policy is, and then ask for the opinion. As I said, unless you are very sure that, okay, these are all the policy makers that you're reaching out to, they should be knowing about it. It's a good practice to briefly state what it is. And then the next guideline is to have equal variation on both sides of the rating scale. I mean, like if you have negative and positive, like strongly disagree to agree or something like that, make sure that you have you give equal number of options for both those choices. And also the other commonly made mistake is sometimes the question, the answer choices do not exactly match with the question, right? The answer may be like yes, no, but we see like to what extent you agree or that kind of questions. We'll see some examples when we do the activity. And then decide the number of points on the scale based on the purpose of your study. Like sometimes you may want to force the respondents to either agree or disagree, and sometimes you may want to give a neutral stance. You may want to give the opportunity for them to take a neutral stance. So it depends on the purpose. For example, some researchers say that if you're measuring attitudes are directional, either they have to be positive or negative. But some people are okay with giving an option like neither disagree nor agree. So it depends on what kind of data you want. And when you are referring to some kind of a past event, it's always a good practice to give some time frame or time range, like what exactly you are referring to. Is it like last 3 years or last 5 years, last 6 months, that kind of a thing. And then if you are using open-ended questions, the size of the text box matters. According to a research done at University of Florida, giving an importance prompt, this question is very important for us to know and all those things. And giving a bigger text box, like if you're using Qualtrics, you can use the essay option, has been found. They did an experimental study where they controlled all the variables and regressed the variables. And they see that giving an importance prompt and a bigger text box has resulted in more number of words to that question. I don't think there has been response, like any research done to see if there was any difference in the quality of responses, but definitely the number of words were more.
it's my turn. So as you all know, surveys can be used for many reasons. They can be used for needs assessments when you're planning a project or a program. They can also be used as process evaluations to understand kind of what challenges or what things can be improved, or if a program or project is going really well and you want to be able to replicate it, you might do like a survey about the process to understand what are the best practices for replication. But right now I'm going to talk about evaluation. Many of you know I identify as an evaluation nerd. So these are more, these next 10 slides or so are more about evaluating programs and projects. So at the top here is a post-survey design, and this is for data that you want to collect at the end of a program activity. So the program happens, and at the end of the program or activity or event, you give out a survey. And so the advantages of this are that you can measure things like customer satisfaction. You know, did they have a positive learning experience? Did they enjoy the Zoom breakouts or the room or the coffee if you're in person? It can also measure self-reported changes in knowledge, attitude, and intention. I'll have you some examples on that. It can also be really useful when time is an issue and participants may not be available before to do like a pre-post test. So you can just do it just quickly at the end of your event or immediately after your event. The disadvantage to this survey type is there's no comparison data, so it's difficult to attribute the magnitude of changes as well as attribution to the event. A source of bias to be mindful of is social desirability. Earlier in the chat, somebody had said one of the issues of a question was, who would say no? So that's kind of the same idea here is, you just spent, X amount of time in investing in learning or participating in events. This, social desirability bias indicates that you may want to say like, yeah, that was a great use of my time, or I really don't want the presenters to feel bad. So, you respond in a very, very favorable way. Next slide, please. Examples of questions. So continuing on with the integrated pest management representation. Here's an example of a post-event question that can measure self-reported knowledge gain. So your instructions in this question would be select one response that best describes any changes you intend to make as a result of participating in this event. So this is, intended behavior change. So two examples are identifying natural enemies, using reduced risk pesticides. Of course, you want to always make sure you covered the items that you are actually asking about. And the response options here, this is actually a scale that we developed with the UC Master Gardener program for their statewide outcome evaluation. I tend to like it a little bit more than the none to some to quite a bit to great deal, because I feel like those are a little bit harder to interpret. So we're pretty proud of this scale. No change. I will start doing this. I already did this, but I will improve, or not applicable. And so those two columns, I will start doing this, or I've already done this, but I will improve. Those two can kind of be collapsed into two kind of intent to change behavior kind of results. So the next type is a pre and post survey design. So this survey type is used to collect data before an activity and again at the end. So it's kind of like a pop quiz or a pre-test before, then you deliver your education, and then you assess them again after your education to see if knowledge has gained. And the advantage to that is it's pretty objective. You're actually testing, do they know the information or do they not know the information? And the disadvantages is that it requires some thoughtful planning and coordination and time, of course. We always have packed agendas, right? So you have to really think about, the cost of time that you might be missing out on. And then the source of bias here to be mindful of is response shift. So sometimes, for example, if you ask a pre question, they might think they know the answer to something, but after the training, they realize just how much they don't know about the topic, and they might actually rate themselves lower on something. So this is more for like kind of self-reported kind of knowledge gain or behavior change questions, but it's something to be mindful of. And I don't have an example for this one because we shared one last week, but it was another IPM example with pictures of snails and slugs. And they asked them before the training to state what type of snail or slug each one is. And then they shared the same set, exact same set again after the training to see if knowledge increased or decreased. Next slide, please. This is the one that we often use, program planning and evaluation, and we often recommend it, post with retrospective pre-survey design. So the idea is you have your educational event or program, and immediately after the program or activity, you ask both post questions and ask them to think back to before the activity and rate their level of understanding then. So that response shift bias that I just mentioned isn't really, it's mitigated a little bit more because now you're asking them the same question and they're at the same kind of level of understanding of what they're actually being asked. And so the advantages here is that you can report self-reported changes again, but the difference here between this and the post survey is that this time you can actually measure magnitude. So you can see the point differences between the post and retrospective pre. Let's see. So that's the comparison data, and it's useful when a traditional pre-survey is not feasible. It's also, like I mentioned, known to minimize response shift bias. But other sources of biases are social desirability, because again, it's at the end of a workshop, you know, same reasons as before. Recall, like the ability to recall what your level of behavior or level of knowledge was before the program or activity. You might not remember. And yeah, I think I mentioned the other one already, effort justification. You kind of spent a lot of time coming to this event, so you know you're kind of wanting to attend. So yeah, you can go to the next slide, Vikram, with an example. So this is an example of a more kind of open-ended pre and post question. You often see them with like response scales, like strongly agree, disagree, but wanted to give an example of how you could also ask for this question in a more open-ended format. So the question is, after the training, how many acres of native bee habitat do you intend to establish? And then before the training, how many acres of native bee habitat were on your land? And the idea here is that you can subtract the two and be able to report back to your funders or grantors or whoever how many acres you could may be affected by the participants learning from your training.
Kit, you have a question. Can you explain response shift bias again?
Sure. Response shift bias, it's kind of like you don't know what you don't know, right? And so when you ask a question before like say a good example is, Carrie, if I were to ask you before a training begins, what is your level of understanding of survey development? And you say before the training, oh, I think it's pretty good. Then you attend the training and then you realize maybe how much you didn't actually know about survey design, or you realize that there were a lot of things that you could have been doing differently. And then after the training, you are asked again to rate your level of understanding about surveys. And then because you know a lot more from attending the training, you might actually end up rating yourself lower after the training. So response shift bias happens more for like kind of self-reported levels of understanding. Does that answer your question, Gary? Hopefully. Yes, thanks. And then the post-retrospective pre and follow-up survey design, this one is super rigorous and it requires a lot more planning and resources. So 3 data collection points are collected. First, you have your program or your activity. Then you do that combination retrospective pre-post survey at the end of your event. And then a few months later, you do a follow-up survey and ask behavior change questions again. The advantages of this is, again, it's super rigorous. It really, but it's still pretty practical. It's doing a follow-up survey is one of the only ways to measure self-reported behavior change. Because people need time right before they can actually implement behaviors. They can't implement something like right at the end of your activity. They might need a few months. Another advantage is that the follow-up comparison data is considered to be more conservative than the data collected in other survey designs. idea is it mitigates bias. So, you know, at the end of a training, you might be really excited, might be really motivated. You have all this intent to change behaviors, but 6 months later, life happens, and you know, you are able to see if you were, when asked if you were actually able to implement the behaviors, you can state, you know, that maybe you didn't actually get to do those things. And so every time I have done this, there's always been a retrospective pre is kind of like low, and then post jumps up really, really high. And then when I do the follow-up drops down a little bit, but it's usually still higher than the retrospective pre. So that's what I kind of meant by like a follow-up being a little bit more conservative. The disadvantage is it takes a lot of time, especially if you want to pair your follow-up survey responses to the retrospective pre-posts. It involves coming up with ID codes, making sure people somehow remember their ID codes. Another way to do it is not to pair them, to just do independent samples when you're, but then that way, I mean, you don't have paired samples, so that's kind of a drawback there. And again, the biases are still present, but they're minimized. So if you could go to the next slide, I think I have an example. This is a repeat of the retrospective pre-post question on top. After the training, how many acres of habitat did you intend to establish? And before the training, how many acres already existed? Then the idea here is that 3 to 6 months, or if you have the kind of program where they actually need 12 months, like a whole year to implement something, then you would use your discretion to decide it's like a 12-month follow-up. Then you ask them again, how many acres of native bee habitat did you actually establish on your land? So again, this one was really rigorous. I recommend it, especially if you want to like publish in journal articles and things like that. It is a lot more, because it requires so much more time and resources and coordination. I wouldn't do it for everything. And the next one, I think this is the last example, is just a pure follow-up survey design. It's data that's collected 3 to 6 or up to your discretion, 12 months after a program. The advantages to this type of survey, it's the only survey that can measure self-reported behavior change, because again, people can't self-report behavior change immediately after an event. They need time to actually implement the practices. This is also helpful when time is an issue and you don't have time to survey your participants at the immediate end of a program. So you're kind of strategically planning to, you know, use up all of your time for your educational activity and planning to do, you know, 3 to 6 to 12 month follow-up after. Another advantage is you can conduct multiple paired follow-ups over a longer period of time to assess sustained behavior change. So you could do a 3-month follow-up and then do a 12-month follow-up and keep tracking your participants and seeing what behavior changes are happening or not. The disadvantage is if you do a solely follow-up survey design, there's no comparison data. I would not recommend doing retrospective pre in combination with a 3 to 6 or 12-month follow-up. Like recall is already hard enough when you do it at the end of an activity. It'll be even harder for them to recall 3 months, 6 months, you know, before an activity. Yeah, so next slide, please. Here's an example of, oh yeah, it's actually really similar to the other example, but the idea here is that you can ask this same type of question 3 months after, and they can say yes or no, I have not identified natural enemies. I still have not yet, but I still intend to start identifying natural enemies. I have started doing this. That's the new one that's new to this slide. And then I already did this before, but I have improved or not applicable. All right, next slide, please. And yes, Catherine mentioned in the chat, we encourage focusing energy on follow-up surveys so you can measure actual self-reported behavior change. And these slides were adapted from a resource that we, UCANR Program Planning and Evaluation, put on our Cooperative Extension website. Lots of resources, additional resources on that So I see a question here that I want to try to address. Do you need to ask in advance for permission to send follow-up in X months? Yes, you should ask for permission, and you should also, it's also a good marketing strategy. So for example, the UC Master Gardener outcome evaluation, at every Master Gardener event, we have asked the Master Gardener volunteers to collect emails, and with the collection of emails, there is a note there. And back in the paper days, you know, it said like, we would like to send you a follow-up survey a few months after. I'm not actually sure what the pivot is now in the online. We've been talking about it, but I'm not sure. But the idea is that in addition to the sign up happening, then when you're asking for their emails, you're letting them know that we're asking your emails so that we can send you a follow-up survey. The second thing that we do is we've given all the Master Gardener volunteers some example marketing materials. So there's a slide, there's flyers saying, hey, in 3 months, you're going to receive a survey. It would help us out so much. There's no incentive, but it's like, you know, we just really, really need to be able to communicate, you know, our value, our public value and things like that. So it kind of describes to them why it's important and when they can expect to receive it. And then immediately after each event, they get an email from the statewide office saying, hey, thanks for attending the event. Again, as a reminder, you're going to receive a survey in 3 months, and this is the email address it'll come from. No reply at Qualtrics eServer whatever.com. So yes, lots of asking for permission in advance and reminding them that it's coming and telling them why it's important for them to respond. Thanks for that.
Kit, there is one more question. What kind of response rate can be expected in a follow-up, and what is considered legitimate for data analysis?
That one's up for debate. So I've been involved in projects where a 10% response rate is a win, because that one, the context of that one was, it was like a 13-state evaluation. We were evaluating childcare providers. The level of removal between the childcare providers and us evaluators was so far. So it was technically, I think we were considering it like a population survey, and 10% was a win. But Vikram, I know you have other stats you might want to share for that.
Yeah, I can share a journal article which gives like what kinds of response rates have been achieved with the different types of survey designs. I don't remember it at the top of my head. I'll share that with Kerry and everyone else. And the next part is what...
Oh, sorry, one more thing, Vikram. With the UC Master Gardener outcome evaluation, we've been really pleased with the response rate. It's been over 30%, at least for the first.
That is really high. That's really high.
Extremely high. I think within California, and if you're measuring with your own clientele, I think 20% is actually reasonable to expect for a follow-up survey.
Mm-hmm. And then the other part of that question is what sample size is considered, like response rate is considered legitimate for data analysis? Like how many people should be there? Like,
did you want to answer that one?
Yeah, so while there is no rule as such, I think there's no limit. But again, people have differing opinions on this. I think like if you have 50 responses or at least more than 30 as some fields identify, you would be able to run like more parametric, like more advanced level statistics on those kind of sample sizes. But I know like including Roshan, who is on this person who like he has a different view that it has to be randomly drawn and it has to follow certain assumptions. But again, maybe like 30 to 50, you can go with that. And even if you get a very like a lower response rate, like less than 30, we can still try attempting some non-parametric statistics. So any response rate can be okay. But if it is too low, and if you want to submit it to a peer-reviewed outlet, some reviewers may have some issues if you have like a 10 or 15 sample size, like people reporting n is equal to 15, that may be an issue.
And I also think that for the purposes of reporting merit...
One more question. Maybe you can answer that, Kit, or I can do that, or Roshan. Will 20% response rate be sufficient to use for impact statements?
Yeah, I was actually going to say, Carrie, that I think regardless of the number or percent of response rate for reporting purposes, like if you're reporting to your grantors or for your PR, I think it's important to just state what your response rate was and how many people responded. Because, I think, when it comes to grants and PRs and things like that, every effort that we put in should be probably acknowledged. So as long as you state how many people responded and what your response rate was, that would be good.
Yeah. So that is really important, right? 20% of what? Like always good to give both the number and then the percentage.
Kit,